Adam Curtis, in his 2016 BBC documentary, argues that over the past few decades, governments and financiers have replaced the complex real world and built a simple fake world that is kept stable through dogmatic politics. On the 13th of February in 2008, Kevin Rudd stood up in a proud voice and gave a formal apology to Indigenous Australia for the stolen generations. The speech was nationally broadcasted, it made front-page news, and was presumed to be a catalyst for change in Indigenous communities and leftist politics at the time. However, only hours later, after the 220 years it took for Australian politicians to acknowledge the mistreatment of Indigenous Australians, the then leader of the Greens Party, Bob Brown, ceased to perpetuate the apology into action and added a commitment to compensate the families affected by the stolen generations, which was outruled by literally every non-Greens Party member 65-4. This dogmatic politics had been a trend in the West since the Bush-Blair era at the turn of the millennium. The idea of it being hyper-normal comes from the same rhetoric that President Obama used when he publicly stated that he would remove troops from Iraq, and followed by sending more, or when he received a Nobel Prize for a speech on nuclear disarmament, during a time where nuclear spending was at an all-time high. Kevin Rudd and Australian politicians seized the opportunity to use a dogmatic, hyper-normal rhetoric and publicly announce that their sympathy with the past treatment of Indigenous people through an apology, however doggedly following the exact same pomposity as before. It is our role as Australian educators of the future to uncover this kind of dogmatic politics, which use media to broadcast a world that sounds buoyant and progressive when the reality is vastly different. As educators, we have the ability to reverse the conceptions by teaching critical thinking skills, to ensure students and communities are politically aware, incorporate Indigenous pedagogies of learning such as 8 Ways and the Both Ways methods, by personalising and contextualising the learning experience, encouraging all students to be active members of society, empowering them with a vision of actual real-world justice, and the end goal to view Indigenous Australia as people, not a social problem, which will be a great step in bridging the gap in health, education, employment, poverty and crime between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. 9 years ago, Kevin Rudd gave a highly engaging and passionate speech on the discourse of the stolen generations, leaving his audience with an impression of hope and justice for Indigenous people in Australia, claiming that this is a new page in history, promising a future where this Parliament resolves the injustices of the past and that harnesses the determination to close the gap in life expectancy, health and education. Now, this is a key event in Australian history because it shows that it is of a populist belief of Australians to resolve injustices and bridge the gap. However, the aftermath of the following 9 years of government have shown ineffective and unproductive. The 2014 Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantages report shows that Kevin Rudd's apology has not had a positive effect on actual change in Australia. 40% of Indigenous people remain out of the workforce or unemployed. The number of Indigenous people in prison outnumbers non-Indigenous 18-1. The median weekly income remains almost half that of a non-Indigenous person, and less than half of Indigenous students finish school after grade 12. This event has particularly trivialised the sector of education, as it has potential to tokenise our response to Indigenous education in primary school classrooms. Celebrating Sorry Day or Mabo Day and teaching of this huge step that Australia took in 2008 lacks critical thought and can hypothetically parallel the idea of hypernormalisation or the reality of a fake world into a generation of youth. Chris Garner's efforts to revolutionise education for Indigenous people in the Northern Territory shows how Indigenous people learn best when it is contextual, relevant and personal. He claims that teachers in mainstream education seem to have a fear that by personalising learning they cannot adhere to the national standards of the curriculum. Garner's study shows actual proof that by designing activities that are contextual, reforming the equation of success to potential times effort plus context equals success. In the 4th year of his programme, he's seen an increase from 32% of Indigenous students finishing Year 12 and entering the workforce to a massive 98%. An important factor here is the personalisation and revolutionising our idea of Western success to a more personal and contextual version. Part of the issue in this country is the continuum to view Indigenous Australia as a social problem that needs to be fixed, rather than viewing these people and their systems on education as sophisticated equals of our nation. So how can we promote educational reform and practice that benefits and caters for the preservation of Indigenous culture and encourages political awareness and critical thought? Post-apology Australia sparked conversation of bridging the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. However, the ethnocentrism of Australian policymakers in education continues to play a role in the separatist of cultures. Marmot claims that the first step in bridging the gap is to recognise Indigenous people and their culture as equal to our own. The progression to assimilate through the 20th and 21st century has taken a solemnly white approach, especially in education, which is the compound for change on a broader scale. Recognising Indigenous pedagogies such as Young Kapurta's 8 Ways and tying it to the teaching across all learning areas can have a grave significance on the learning of not only Indigenous students, but all students, because Vygotsky states that students learn best when they're active in the learning process. Makaguchi and Toda state that students learn best when they can create value from their learning. The 8 Ways pedagogies links hands-on inquiry learning with oral storytelling while connecting it to land and community, a philosophy that would be current in all modern learning pedagogies. So why is it deemed only suitable for Indigenous students? It is this exact separatist approach that continues to add to the division of races in Australia. Now, it may seem crass to carp about the deficiencies of such a joyous and monumental event in Australian history. However, what Rudd's speech lacked was a sense of urgency, a plan, or a look into the causes of the gap to further bridge the cultures closer. The current facts demonstrate the issue of contemporary Indigenous Australia. A 2013 study states that 33 times more Indigenous people are hospitalised each year. Life expectancy is 11 years lower than non-Indigenous, and infant mortality twice that of non-Indigenous Australia. The most staggering post-apology statistic is the rise in youth suicide, from 10% of Indigenous youth 15 years prior to a massive 80% in 2013. Rudd's speech was confronting and sparked conversation amongst Australia nationwide. However, the real wrongs of mass genocide remain in the unconscious guilt of the heart of Australia, and words such as genocide were even failed to be recognised in the apology. Furthermore, the fact that no sustainable or suitable social actions were taken post-apology makes you wonder what significance it really had at all. Having a critical understanding of how this event trivialised Australian society as well as perplexed the collective Indigenous psyche is essential as a teacher in contemporary Australian society. To know that it is not the policy, not the apology that will bring direct action to bridging the gap, it is the actions in the classroom that matter, as well as a deep understanding of history, and also contextualising and personalising the teaching of all subject areas for Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students to create value from their learning experience. Sarah Madison in Beyond White Guilt exemplifies the state of Rudd's apology failing to be associated with action and thus the consequential effect on the victim. She claims that an apology requires communication between wrongdoer and victim. Harrison claims that Australia's refusal to even discuss compensation of the families involved makes the apology inevitably inadequate, superficial, insincere, and meaningless. An important aspect of this that should be taken into contemporary Australia classroom is the understanding that the making of an apology does not mean that a dispute is resolved or issues of historical human injustice are settled. Political philosopher Bashir claims that a pedagogical approach that revolutionises this romanticised version of colonial history we have can help citizens redefine their version of history and connect it to current political, social and economic inequalities. Madison also claims that something that is rooted in contemporary Australian collective guilt is a wonder why what they have done isn't enough. Why are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders still struggling? Didn't we change the constitution? Didn't we apologise and reconcile? By reforming the ways we tell stories of our past can confront collective guilt head on and supply students with a wealth of knowledge, albeit confronting and provocative, can encourage non-Indigenous and Indigenous students alike to join the struggle to bridge the gap. Consequently, Rudd's speech has had an impact on many of the lives of Indigenous people around Australia in that it sparked conversation around the topic of bridging the gap. However, a conversation without following action is futile. Young Porta's 8 Ways pedagogy should be recognised by educators nationwide to actively bridge the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. By personalising the learning experience, it will help students create value in their learning and furthermore, their future. Rudd's speech, as confronting and heart-struck as it was, did not reveal the true mistreatments of the hidden genocide of our country. Its failure to follow with consequent social measures of current Western political rhetoric and facts state its insignificance in bridging the gap between the cultures in Australia. Therefore, its significance to Indigenous people lies only in the opening of a conversation and is not a sufficient step for the progression of our society. However, these bridges can be built through a sound and real understanding of Indigenous culture, education and history, which when incorporated into teaching practice will lead Australia on a path to a more true reconciliation. Thank you.